no time. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has says in Surah Humaza, يَحْسَبُونَ أَنَّ مَا لَهُ أَخْلَدًا. The nature of this dunya is that we get so engrossed in it, so immersed in it, that it makes us forgetful of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But there's something worse than it making us forgetful. It makes us feel like we're immortal, like we're never going to die. Akhlada, I'm going to live forever. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even reminds the Quraysh, إِنَّكَ مَيِّتٌ وَإِنَّهُمْ مَيِّتُونَ. You, yani Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, are going to die, and they're going to die as well. So remember death and think about how you're going to face Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on the day of judgment. Knowing that what you believe in is wrong, worshipping idols, being pagans. Contemplate. But when a person becomes forgetful of maut, a person gets immersed in the dunya, gets deceived by the dunya, then he starts living his life. Though everybody knows that death is going to come, he lives his life like he is going to live forever. Tajib. We know we're not going to live forever, but we get deceived by the dunya into believing that we're going to live forever, and that's how we act. You know, a person's at 70 or 80 years of age, right? 70 years old, 80 years old, and he's still so engrossed in dunya. There was this person, he was 80 or 90 years old, and he's been married for 70 some years. They were taking his interview and asking him the reason for the longevity of his marriage, why he was able to have such a successful marriage for so many years, like 6 decades, 7 decades. So during that interview, and this guy is like 80, 90 years old or something, and he was talking about why he still likes to go to the barber shop because there's young women there to cut his hair. Ajib, at that age, and you're still thinking about dunya. You're still immersed in the dunya, right? How a person thinks that he's going to live forever even though he knows he's going to die. He looks at his age, he's frail now. Ajib. Anyways, the thing that I wanted to mention was that Brother Kamran told me after I made announcement, which I mentioned, give some nasiha about Brother Mahmoud Khan. He said that the day before he passed away, he was talking to Brother Kamran, and he said to him that, sometimes it's very chilly, so shaitan tells me not to come to the masjid. I make sure I counter that by coming 15 minutes earlier. So that's why you used to see always used to be in the front sufuf. He used to be in the first row or the second row most of the time. So he said he had that fear that shaitan would get to him and would not allow him to come to the masjid. So he'd make sure he countered that by overstepping him and saying, no, I'm going to do just the opposite. I'm going to come 15 minutes earlier. So he would come 15 minutes before every salah, and usually was in the first or second row. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala must have loved this, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took him in that state. Subhanallah. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant him maghfirah. The good people are leaving, and the only people are left in the prophecy according to the hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam are huthalatun minan nas, the husk. When you clean wheat, the wheat comes down at the bottom of the sieve, and what remains at the top? The husk, the cover, right? The stuff that we throw away. So he's saying the time before the day of judgment, the people that will remain will be the husk. In other words, people who outwardly look really good, but inwardly they're nothing. There's nothing in them. Right? They're khali. Nothing inside. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us all. So we were talking about Abu Ayyub Ansari Radhi-Allahu anhu. He paid Uqbah bin Amir al-Juhni Radhi-Allahu anhu a visit while he was governor, meaning Uqbah Radhi-Allahu anhu was governor of Misr. Long after many of the Sahaba Ridwanullahi Majma'in had already passed away. And he made this visit, I mentioned, 2 times. Once as a ghazi, meaning that he came to Misr to fight in the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. إعلاء كلمة الله. That was the first reason. And then he came on a second occasion for a completely different reason. So one, to bring the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, make the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala high. That was the first reason, by struggling in the path of Allah. And the second reason is in this hadith, which I am going to share with you today. It mentions, Ata ibn Abi Rabah is the narrator of this story. Ata ibn Abi Rabah was a great mufassir of Quran Kareem in Makkah Mukarramah. He is the teacher of Imam Abu Hanifa and many other great tabi'een. He says, Abu Ayyub Radhi-Allahu anhu came to Uqbah bin Amir when Uqbah bin Amir was the governor of Misr, and he asked him about a hadith that Uqbah bin Amir had heard from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. لم يبقى أحد سمعه من رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم غيره وغير عقبة. Nobody remained who had heard this hadith from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam besides two people, Abu Ayyub and Uqbah bin Amir. Which means there were very few Sahaba left in that time. And of those who were left, none of them had heard this hadith. The only two who had heard it were Abu Ayyub and Uqbah bin Amir. So, فَلَمَّا قَدِمَ, when he came to Misr, أَتَى مَنْزِلَ مَسْلَمَ ibn Makhlad al-Ansari وَهُوَ أَمِيرُ مِصْرَ. He came to the house of Maslama ibn Makhlad al-Ansari. I don't know if he's a Sahabi or not. Definitely a Tabi'i. And he was the assistant governor of of Misr. So he was informed, Maslama was informed that Abu Ayyub Ansari has come from Medina and he is outside your house right now at this moment. So, فَخَرَجَ إِلَيْهِ فَعَانَقَهُ. He came out and he hugged him and asked him to come inside. He welcomed him. And he said, no. I don't want to come inside your house. He said, why? He said, because I've come with a purpose, a mission. What's your mission? مَا جَابِكَ أَبَا أَيُّوبَ. Why have you come? He says, حديث سمعته من رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لم يبقى أحد سمعه من رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم غيري وغير عقبة. There's a hadith that I've heard from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There does not remain on the surface of this earth anyone who has heard that hadith beside myself and Uqbah bin Amir. Two people. فَبَعَثْ مَنْ يَدُلُّنِي عَلَى مَنْزِلِي. I don't want to enter your house. I want you to go send somebody to call him or show me the way to go to his house. Take me to his house. So he didn't even enter the house. And he's just come from a long journey. From where? Medina Munawwara to Misr. How long is Medina Munawwara to Misr? It's not around the neighborhood. It's not a block around the neighborhood. We're talking hundreds of miles on camel. So, فَبَعَثَ مَعَهُ مَنْ يَدُلُّهُ عَلَى مَنْزِلِ عُقْبَةِ. So he sent with him someone to escort him, to take him all the way to the house of Uqbah bin Amir. Uqbah bin Amir was informed that Abu Ayyub Ansari has come from Medina Munawwara. فَعَجَّلَ. So whatever Uqbah bin Amir was doing, he dropped it. He ran to the door, opened the door, and he met his friend and Sahabi, right? Of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, call it co-sahabi, right? Both of them are sahaba of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. فَخَرَجَ إِلَيْهِ فَعَانَقَهُ. Came out and he hugged him and he said, مَا جَابِكَ أَبَا أَيُّوبَ. He said, what have you come for? He says, I heard a hadith which no one beside you and me are left who have heard that hadith. Uqbah says, Naam, yes, I have heard this hadith from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. مَنْ سَتَرَ مُؤْمِنًا فِي الدُّنْيَا عَلَى خِزْيِهِ سَتَرَهُ اللَّهُ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ. Whoever hides a fault of a mu'min in this dunya that he had committed, that's humiliating for him, Allah will hide his fault on the day of judgment in front of everyone. This is the hadith. He came to learn just one hadith. Now the question is, he already knew the hadith, then why has he come to hear it from Uqbah bin Amir radiallahu anhu? If he already knew the hadith. Because he doesn't want to narrate a hadith from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam until he's absolutely sure that he heard it exactly the way he wants to narrate it. For fear that he says something that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam never says and attributes it to him, and he's held accountable for it on the Day of Judgment. As Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, whoever attributes to me something that I never said, he should make his abode in the hellfire. So Sahaba Radwanullahi Majma'in always were in that state of fear. There are some Sahaba like Abdullah bin Masud, knew thousands of hadith, never narrated a hadith. Never narrated a hadith. Abdullah bin Masud is known, Amr ibn Maymun, one of the students of Mu'adh bin Jabal radiallahu anh, from Yemen. He was sitting with Abdullah bin Masud. He said, I sat with him every single Thursday night, and he would talk to us about matters related to Islamic rulings and fiqh. And he talked about all sorts of different things related to the deen, but he would never narrate a hadith from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Years and years and years went by, never narrated a hadith. Only once he said Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, and suddenly he went into panic. He just started panicking. He opened up his shirt because he started sweating profusely. And he was perspiring, and he took a towel and he was cleaning up his forehead. And his veins were bulging. He was in so much fear. His face was red hot, flushed. And he got up and he was just moving around. And then he said, قال شبيها بذلك قربا من ذلك دون ذلك أو أكثر من ذلك. Rasulullah said something like that, something more than that, something less than that, something close to that. So that he does not say something that Rasulullah never said. This is how careful Sahaba were. So, when we receive hadith from Rasulullah and somebody tells us there's a hadith, this is because of the level of cautiousness of the Sahaba Ridwanullahi Majma'in, which they passed on to the Tabi'i and onwards. That level of cautiousness, right? Now we can just narrate a hadith from Sayyid Bukhari and say Bukhari. But in those days when they didn't have books, you had to rely on your memory. And it was they were very fearful of narrating something from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam if they didn't know it. So that level of caution still existed amongst the muhaddithun throughout the times until the hadith came into book form. Anyhow, so this is a hadith. Abu Ayyub Ansari radiallahu anhu said, Sadaqta. He spoke the truth. This is exactly as I know the hadith. ثم انصرف أبو أيوب إلى راحلته. Then Abu Ayyub Ansari said, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Gotta go home. Went back to his mount, mounted it, فَرَكِبَهَا رَاجِعًا إِلَى الْمَدِينَةِ, and returned to Medina Munawwara. Didn't even sit down to have dinner. Or just, sit around and talk for a little while. He only came for one purpose, and it was fulfilled, and now, time to go back. Right? We said, let's have one night rest. I've been traveling for 2 months. I need at least one night rest. No rest. Subhanallah. This was their connection with the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Talk about preservation of the deen of Allah. Traveling hundreds of miles for one hadith, which he already knew, but wanted to reconfirm with another sahabi, so that the transmission is solid if he narrates it to anybody else. Their level of taqwa, their level of fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's why the deen has remained in the pristine state that it is today through their efforts. We have to continue and perpetuate that. Right? That same spirit. Right? May Allah give us the tawfiq to continue this practice and this spirit of the Sahaba of preservation of hadith, their level of taqwa, of cautiousness in deen. Nowadays, people are just letting things out on WhatsApp and what's the other stuff, right? And there's no references for it. There's no, the Arabic is not in there, so you don't know what the hadith is, and somebody just quotes it. Sometimes it's a qawl of a tabi'i. Sometimes it's a qawl of a person who came hundreds of years later. Maybe he's one of the awliya of Allah. That's great. But it's still not a hadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You have to clarify that. Because people may assume this is a hadith and it's not. Anyhow. So that is the end of our sessions on Abu Ayyub Ansari radiallahu anhu. And as I mentioned, we will now continue, since we were talking about Uqbah bin Amir radiallahu anhu, and we know a little bit more about him now, in light of the story and the context of Abu Ayyub Ansari radiallahu anhu. So instead of talking about Abu Musa Ash'ari radiallahu anhu, we'll continue with Uqbah bin Amir al-Juhani radiallahu anhu, who is not a very well-known Sahabi, except if you study the ahadith of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because he narrated many ahadith from Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Now, he is from the tribe of Banu Juhayna. Banu Juhayna was not a tribe of Medina Munawwara, nor a tribe that lived anywhere near Makkah Mukarramah, let alone in Makkah Mukarramah. Banu Juhayna was settled in Sham area, the area of Sham. Okay. So he must have came from Sham, but according to, if you look at the ahadith and the historical accounts, it seems like he was born and raised in Medina Munawwara, or at least he migrated to Medina Munawwara and was living there now for the longest time. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam heaped a lot of praise upon the tribe of Banu Juhayna. So he says in a hadith, very famous hadith, he says, وَالَّذِي نَفْسِ مُحَمَّدٍ بِيَدِي, I swear by the one in whose hands is Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam's life, لَغِفَارٌ وَأَسْلَمْ وَمُزَيْنَ وَمَنْ كَانَ مِنْ جُهَيْنَ خَيْرٌ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ يَوْمَ الْقِيَامَةِ مِنْ أَسَدْ وَطَيٍّ وَغَطْفَانَ. These are names of different tribes. The tribe of Banu Ghifar, this is the tribe of Abu Dhar Ghifari radiallahu anhu. The tribe of Aslam. So if you hear a Sahabi's name Aslami, right, that's a Sahabi from the tribe of Banu Aslam. Muzayna, Muzani, okay? And Juhayna, this is the tribe of Uqbah bin Amir. وَمَنْ كَانَ مِن مُزَيْنَ خَيْرٌ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ, they are better in the eyes of Allah on the day of judgment than those people from the tribe of Asad, Banu Tay, and Banu Ghatfan. Why? Because these tribes that Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is praising and saying that they are better in the eyes of Allah on the day of judgment than these other tribes that I mentioned, is because they were the first ones to accept Islam. One of the first of the tribes that accepted Islam in the Jaziratul Arab, not in Saudi Arabia. No Saudi Arabia. It's bid'ah to say Saudi Arabia. It's Jaziratul Arab. There's no hadith that ever mentions anything saying there is a country called Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia means that it's owned by the Saudi, right? Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam called the Arabian Peninsula Jaziratul Arab, the Arabian Peninsula, if you want to translate it, right? So it's not any families. If it's anybody's, it's Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam's. It's his Jazira, because he's the one who brought it to life, right? Nobody would know Jaziratul Arab if it wasn't for Islam. And there would be no Islam if it wasn't for Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So why should we use that name, the political name that's given by a group that just came into power like in the 1920s? Anyhow, so he was from the tribe of Banu Juhayna. His kunya was Abu Hamad. So sometimes his friends and other Sahaba would call him Abu Hamad, and according to another why he's known as Abu Amir. Now he lived in Sham, and Banu Juhayna was from Sham, but it's good to know a little bit of Arab ancestry. So we all have heard of Quraysh, right? We all heard of Quraysh, and we know where Quraysh is from. But how many of us have heard, we've heard of Ansar, but there's no tribe called Ansar. Ansar is a title that was given by Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam for those in Medina Munawwara that supported him. But Ansar generally consisted of two main tribes. Which ones? I've mentioned their names over and over and over again. In all these different sessions we'd have with the Sahaba. Which ones were they? Anybody know? Banu Aus and Banu Khazraj. Banu Aus and Banu Khazraj. But there are other tribes. Like they're not the only tribes that exist in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In Jaziratul Arab, there were other tribes as well. So, Banu Juhayna, it's good to know a little bit of Arab ancestry so you understand like their relation to each other, right? And how Quraysh was the most elevated and the most noble of all tribes. So, Banu Juhayna was from Yemen originally, but they migrated at some time in Jahiliyyah to Sham. Uqbah bin Amir radiallahu anh didn't know his ancestry. He didn't know where he was from originally. There's a riwayah that proves that he did not know where he was originally from. So he says, by the way, this riwayah also tells a little bit about how he accepted Islam and what he was doing at the time of accepting Islam. Uqbah bin Amir Radhi-Allahu was once on a mimbar in Misr, and he's narrating a hadith. He says, Rasulullah came to Medina Munawwara, wa ana fi ghanamin li ar'aha, and I was herding some sheep, meaning that he lived in Medina Munawwara. Right? Now, if he was living in Medina Munawwara, but it doesn't mean that he owned, he was living in Medina Munawwara as a shepherd. Now, being a shepherd usually meant that you were a worker, not an owner. So, he migrated, or maybe his parents migrated, they settled down in Medina Munawwara, he settled down in Medina Munawwara, he's looking for a job, and somebody says, hey, I got a whole bunch of herd of sheep, take care of them, I'll pay you this much. So, he was a wage worker, and he was probably from the lower class, because he was not originally from Medina Munawwara, so he didn't have a house of his own, and so on and so forth. A migrant. So, he says, فَتَرَكْتُهَا. He said, I've heard about Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that there's this person who came from Makkah Mukarramah, and he calls himself a Nabi, and people are accepting Islam. I came to him, and I said, تُبَايِعُنِي ya Rasulullah. Will you allow me to make the bay'ah with you, the pledge, meaning to accept Islam. In other words, his heart had already accepted. He didn't need any proof. He knew. He said, Mimman anta. Where are you from? Which tribe are you from? So I told him. He said, Ayyu ahabbu ilayk. Which bay'ah do you want to do? There's two types of bay'ah. A bay'atu hijratin or bay'atun a'rabiyya. Bay'atu hijratin or bay'atun a'rabiyya. There's two types of bay'ahs, according to this hadith. One bay'ah with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was bay'ah which you made with Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and you settled down in Medina Munawwara because you made the hijrah from wherever to Medina Munawwara. Now the fact that he was making, well, it's going to mention ahead that he chose to make the bay'ah of hijrah proves that he was not originally from Medina Munawwara. So he told Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, I'm from Banu Juhayna. Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, oh, okay, you're not from here. So now you have two choices. You can make the Bay'atul Hijrah or Bay'atul Arabiyah. Which one do you want to make? Bay'atul Arabiyah means you don't have to make Hijrah, you stay where you are. You go back to your tribe, you stay there. Okay? And if we need your help, we'll call you. And the other one is, you stay with us. And that will be your pledge, that you will stay with us to the end of time. This is now your new home for the sake of Allah and His Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And you'll face all hardship and difficulties. You'll leave your family, you leave your home, you leave your settlement, your tribe. Meaning not that you don't visit them, but you never settle down there for the rest of your life. You're going to settle down here. So he said, Bay'atu hijratin. I want to make the bay'ah hijrah. Meaning I'm going to be here and I'm not moving anywhere for the sake of Allah. So he was here for work, but he's changed his status now. He's changed his status. Now his status is as a muhajir. Before he didn't come as a muhajir, he came as a worker. Right? Now he's become a muhajir. He says one day Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam was sitting in a group of Sahaba ridwanullahi majma'in. He said, Man hahuna min ma'addin. Okay. Who here is from Ma'ad? Ma'ad is one of the great grandchildren of Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam. So when you said, are you from Ma'ad? You're basically saying, are you from Ismail alayhi salatu wasalam's lineage? From his blood. So Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is asking, whoever is from Ma'ad, فَلْيَقُمْ, stand up. He said, I stood up. He said, sit down. And then he said again, Man hahuna min Ma'ad. Who here is from Ma'ad? He should stand up. He said, I stood up again. He said, sit down. He's like, what? Right? He's kind of confused. Third time, he said this, asked the same question, and he stood up again, and he said, sit down. So then he said, Mimman nahnu ya Rasulullah? If we're not from the blood of Ismail alayhi salatu wasalam, then where are we from? He said, Anta min Qudaa bin Malik bin Himyar. Himyar. Himyar means Yemen. Banu Himyar is a tribe which was from Yemen. So he's basically saying to him that you are not from the family of Ismail alayhi salatu salam, you are from Yemen. Which tells us that there are two types of Arab groups that exist to this day. Arabs are divided in two main groups. One group of Arabs that were originally from Yemen, and another group of Arabs that were originally from the awlad of Ismail alayhi salatu wasalam. So not all Arabs are originally Ibrahimi in their blood. So for example, the Ansar are not Ibrahimi. They are not from the awlad of Ibrahim alayhi salam. They also are descendants of the people who migrated from Yemen. Banu Juhayna is also another tribe who are descendants of people who migrated from Yemen and eventually settled down in Sham. Right? So he didn't know where he was from. Right? Most Arabs did. He apparently didn't. And then Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam clarified for him, because he thought all along, I'm from Banu Ismail. And now he knows, no, you're not from Banu Ismail. You're from down south. A different bloodline. We also know that he had a sister who also lived in Medina Munawwar. And we'll end with this, inshallah. We'll continue this next week. This is a hadith of Sayyid Bukhari. Uqbah bin Amir radiyallahu anhu narrates that my sister made a nadhr. Anybody know what a nadhr is? وَمَا أَنفَقْتُم مِّن نَفَقَةٍ أَوْ نَذَرْتُم مِّن نَذْرٍ. Nadhr, what does nadhr mean? When you make an oath. Oh Allah, if you do this for me, I will do this. There's a nadhr. So his sister had made a nadhr, an oath. His sister had made a nadhr that she would walk from Medina Munawwara to Makkah Mukarramah to perform her Hajj. Walk and perform her Hajj. Meaning that she couldn't use a camel or a horse or any other type of mount. She would have to walk it. And the idea behind it was to make a sacrifice for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَأَمَرَتْنِي أَنْ أَسْتَفْتِيَ لَهَا النَّبِيَّ صَلَّى اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَسَلَّمَ. And then she started second guessing herself. Did I make the right oath? Meaning, should I have really done that? So she asked Uqbah bin Amir radiyallahu anh to go ask Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, what's the ruling about this nadhr? So I came to Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Uqbah bin Amir says, فَاسْتَفْتَيْتُهُ. And I asked him, Ya Rasulullah, this is what my sister said, the oath she made. Now she doesn't know, should she fulfill it or not? Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, لِتَمْشِي وَلْتَرْكَبْ. She should walk and she should also mount. Now there's a big difference of opinion based on this hadith of Bukhari between the scholars. Big difference of opinion. When you make an oath, okay, if you break it, do you have to fulfill whatever penalty you put on yourself in that nadhr? I'll do this, whether it's 5 fasts or whatever. I'll give this much money. Or you don't have to. According to some, well, actually not some, only one group. Because of this hadith, you don't have to do anything. You don't have to pay kafara, as they say. Expiation. Call it expiation. You don't have to pay any expiation. Look, the hadith says. But the jamhur, when I say jamhur, I mean Imam Shafi'i, Imam Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal, which is basically most of the ummah right there. Like 99%. They say, no. This hadith is not clarifying whether she should pay the kafara or not. It's just telling her that, listen, this walking business, it doesn't serve any real purpose. It doesn't give you closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there's no purpose of just walking and killing yourself over it. Do something else. If one person says, I'll fast for 5 days, that makes sense. That's an ibadah. But walking for Hajj is not an ibadah. So why would you want to fulfill it? That's what Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam is saying here. Not to say that she's still not going to pay her kafara. But somebody may open the hadith of Bukhari and say, oh, I can make a nadhr and I don't have to pay the kafara. Look. Learn from the fuqaha, learn from the scholars. Don't become your sheikh, your own sheikh. Don't become your own sheikh. Because then your shaitan will become your biggest sheikh. So we know that he had a sister who also lived in Medina Munawwara. And if he had a sister living in Medina Munawwara, most likely that means that his whole family had settled down in Medina Munawwara. But there's no mention of them anywhere in the hadith or his own biography. So inshallah we'll leave the rest of this for next week inshallah. And then after that, if we have time, we will start with Abu Musa al-Ash'ari radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. جزاكم الله خير. أحسن الجزاء.